So like I said at the end of our study of 2 Samuel, we're taking a little bit of a break and we're going to look at some of the literature that is taking place around this time of the reign of David and also during the beginning of Solomon's reign. And what I want you to do first of all is to get a little bit of an overview. So if you look at the table of contents on your Bible, you'll notice that if you go from Genesis and you go to Esther, you're going to have basically a more or less straight through narrative chronologically of the events of the Bible. And then if you go from there to Isaiah all the way to Malachi, you have the writings of the prophets. So think of the New Testament has those epistles written by the early church apostles. You can kind of think of the prophets in that same vein, that these are the writings of the prophecies of these prophets talking to the Israelite people, warning them about what's to come. And so that is its own category towards the end. Most of these aren't narratives, aside from Daniel and Jonah, but for the most part, these are the writings of the prophets. And so that's the two main bases of the Old Testament. You got your narrative, and then you got your prophets at the end, and then the middle is everything else. And today we're going to cover the everything else. You could generally call them the wisdom literature, but there are a lot of different writings. So they're wisdom writings, there's songs, there's romance, the Song of Songs. There's just a lot of different literature. And you might be asking, why does the New Testament have this? Why is it in the Old Testament? If you think of the New Testament, what does it cover? It only covers what? One person's lifetime, and then the lifetime of the people who knew that person. So Jesus, and then the lifetime of the disciples until they die. And so you're only thinking of really one lifetime. When here in the Old Testament, you're thinking thousands of years and a history of an entire nation. And so, we don't have a collection of literature, of writings, of art, of things like that, unlike what we have in the Old Testament that we've gotten passed down during the Israelite as a culture, as a nation. And so as time went on, they've collected these liturgies, these, romance, words of wisdom, so different genres that you're not going to find in the New Testament. So that's really going to cover from Job all the way to Songs of Solomon. So that middle part is what we're going to discuss briefly about. And so if you look as wisdom literature, just kind of like what I was saying, don't think of it as just one type of literature. This is many, many genres and many, many influential pieces of literature that would have been circulating around from the reign of David all the way to the end of the Israelite nation at his destruction by Babylon. So these were kind of the set pieces. And at the time, of course, just like the letters of Paul, the letters of Peter, they didn't see these works as scripture when it was being used contemporaneously. So in its use, they just thought of it as prayers. They thought of it as, it's more than just prayers and praises that we see in the Psalms. There's commemorations of weddings. There's coronations of kings in here. There's oaths that we find for those who are entering membership into the temple. So there's just a variety of all kinds of writings that we're going to have. And in fact, the Hebrew, if you look at the Hebrew version of the Old Testament, is called the Tanakh. And Jews will call it that because there's three parts of it: the Torah, the Ketuvim, and the Nevi'im, the prophets, the writings, and the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bibles. So the Ketuvim is kind of a catch-all term of the writings. So this is another word of what we're going through, is the collection of writings. And there's a really rich variety, just like what we've been going over. And the first book that we're going to go over, which is really going to emphasize that, is the Book of Job. And you might look at the Book of Job like, isn't the Book of Job a narrative? Why isn't it part of the narrative? Because it's not mainly a narrative. So the Book of Job, the first book that we're going to look at, is if you think of it as a narrative, you have 2 chapters. You have an introduction to Job, what happens to him, And then you have a conclusion to that narrative in the first 2 chapters in chapter 42. Now, what's in between the other 40-so chapters of the book? Well, it's dialogue, and that's really the focus of the book, is this dialogue between having to suffer at the hands of God. And it's a very well put together story, and it's not just about the beginning. The story itself is really just a backdrop to a larger struggle of wrestling of why do a good, righteous person suffer at the hands of God. And Job, instead of, how we have kind of the 5 stages of grief, you're angry, and then you're kind of okay, you accept slowly but surely. Well, it's the opposite in the story of Job. So at Job, what happens when he gets everything taken away from him at first in chapter 1? Everyone knows chapter 1, verse 20, right? That what the Lord giveth and taketh away. And so he's just very sober and just is like, yep, whatever the Lord does, it's what the Lord's going to do, very dutiful. But as time goes on, and he is in mourning for about 7 days with 3 of his friends, and during that time, just so much is running through his mind. He's really having doubts about, the goodness of God, the justice of God, and he talks in a long series of dialogues with 3 of his friends. So his 3 friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. So he has these 3 close friends, and we usually think of them as kind of like, they're speaking non-truths about, because at the end, what does God do? He chastises the 3 friends, right? But really what the 3 friends are talking the conventional wisdom. If you looked at Proverbs, if you looked at the book of Deuteronomy, that is God's vision. God's vision is that the righteous will prevail and everything ultimately will work out. And so the 3 friends are encouraging him, and they'll say a lot of what we would say. Think about, the narrative is just really that backdrop of a larger question of it could be anybody. If you were going to sit down and talk with a mother who lost, their 3-year-old child to cancer that suffered, for no reason, what did they do that God would do that to that child? And having that mom wrestle through that is the same thing that Job is going through. So just think of the worst case scenario, someone completely undeserving the wrath of the Lord, and how do you wrestle with that? Well, what would you say? Well, maybe you would be like one of their friends and say, well, at the end, God's justice will prevail. Just keep doing well, and God's justice will be, kind of a theodicy that, the greater good is going to be at stake. Or they'll say that, okay, maybe the kid sinned, maybe there was generational sin at hand that God's judgment is for. But just like what you would imagine, all of that really rings hollow, doesn't it? So all that saying doesn't really speak to their situation. And so the beauty of Job is really wrestling, and he gets more and more disappointed in God. And there's kind of motif where, you remember the point where his wife will tell Joab right when he's struck with boils to curse God and die. What that means is throughout this whole ordeal, he's challenged to curse God the whole time, but he doesn't quite get there. First, what does he do? He blames himself. So first he's just, why was I ever born? God, why were these circumstances, these circumstances were worse than death. I'd rather die or never been born than to suffer with the way that I've suffered. And so first he blames himself, but then he's like, God, this really is unfair. You know what? This is really, and so he just gets into the edge. And what he eventually does is he accelerates all the way to what's called a reeve. And a reeve is a concept that doesn't really have a good English equivalent to it. But it's a Hebrew word that basically is like a divine lawsuit. So it's almost like I'm taking God to court in a certain way. So he's challenging God to, hey, I'm going to confront you. I'm basically giving a lawsuit to God saying, no, God, this is, I do not deserve this. This is a wrongful death of my children. So that's the kind of deal that he has. And then God has this very climactic confrontation answering that reeve that Job challenges him with, and basically says that he doesn't have any standing, having the limitations of not knowing how the earth was put together, or how the stars and the constellations. So he goes into all this, a very, very long speech to say that he lacks standing. So at the same time that God is doing that, he's also accosting Job's friends, because Job's friends are equally to be condemned, because they are, even though they're saying what should be truth, if you look at the Bible, but he's also condemning the hollowness that they are in, but also praising Job for being honest. He really rewards Job at the end altogether, because he did the right answer in saying that he was honest. He fled his heart. He even challenged God, even though people were saying, no, don't do it. Don't question God. But he's rewarded for ultimately challenging God, and everything is reset. But it raises so many issues, and there's so much that goes on in the dialogue. And that's why if we were ever to take a break from the roadmap class, or if we ever complete the roadmap class, you really need to take a semester, a spring or a fall, just to go through the whole book, one dialogue at a time, and really wrestle, not assume, have a blank slate, don't know what's going on, and wrestle. What would you do if you're Job right now? What would you be doing if you're a friend right now? And just thinking in those terms instead of, knowing what's going to happen at the end. So it's really just a book of wrestling with those big questions, more so than the narrative. So very, very good book, and one that I hope to explore later in the future. The next book is going to be the Book of Psalms. So the Book of Psalms, you might think of what? Liturgy, right? So just like when Stanley, we have what? We have the Baptist hymnal, right? For many works in Psalms, they were originally a collection of, the Baptist hymnal, First Temple edition, right? So this has been the widespread worship liturgy, and the way we're so confident that they were used in liturgy is because many of these these prayers and these poems were in song notation. So the interesting thing about Psalms is that a lot of it, or well, not a lot of it, but some of it, we don't even know how to translate it. So, the best example is the word Selah. You'll have like a line, and then you'll have like Selah kind of in the middle, breaking each line, and we don't know what that means. We just assume maybe it's some sort of choir direction for, musicians of the temple. So there's a lot of different words, and we don't really know if they were, written just because they were meant to be in the worship or temple, or if these were, songs or experiences. A lot of the Psalms are attributed to things in David's life, if they were, just kind of his events, his diaries that were later transformed and made into these songs, or maybe a combination of both. But either way, it's interesting, and these were very influential pieces during the time of the kingdom of Judah in the Jerusalem temple. But these weren't all what the Psalms were. So we have a variety of different types of writings. Some of them goes back to the tradition of Moses. Psalms 90 is attributed to Moses, so all the way back then. Some of them are way after the time of David, talking about the mourning and the sadness that happened during the destruction of Jerusalem at the 9th of Av. So just prayers of what it's like to go into exile and go into humiliation. So you have just a variety from all spans of the history of Israel, and we can only imagine that they were sometime after the Babylonian exile came and collected and made into what we have today as the Psalms. On top of that, they also have Psalms addressed to human addressees instead of God. So you have proverb-like advice for a human audience. Why should you be righteous? It's very much like Proverbs in the sense of, the way of the righteous is good and godly. The way of the wicked is, punishing and foolish. You have, Psalms 1 is a great example of that. One of these two paths that the speaker wants to try to get the audience to get on board with. Psalm 45 is actually a wedding celebration, so it's more of a celebration of a king and his wife, kind of like a blessing onto their wedding. So this may very well have been a verse spoken during, Josiah's wedding or one of David's successors on their wedding day. This might have been the song that was heard. So really fascinating history behind these writings. And if you look at your sheet, you have kind of 5 different categories. There's a lot of different ways to categorize these psalms, and not a lot of them all neatly fall into one particular bucket. Some of them overlap, but here are some 5 or 6 kind of good broad categories that I would say. The first one is celebrating God's creation and goodness and righteousness and power. So think of this as more of what we think modern as, kind of a modern psalms. Our contemporary music, what do we do in worship? We praise God. We invite others to join in celebrating his beauty and his creation and his power. And so this is kind of your typical song of praise, song of thankfulness. Another motif that we really don't use in many songs today, and even many hymns back in the day, is that what the Hebrews did is that they often cited God's power in historical moments. They'll cite previous events in the Bible, like the parting of the Red Sea, like, praise the Lord who parted the sea, who did this, who did that, who rescued, who gave Abraham the promise of his land, and did this and did that. So they'll point to very specific points in history to be thankful and praise God, and make these really notable citations in their songs. The next one is Enthronement Songs. So these are psalms that follow a very specific motif and formula, all of that which give God a metaphor for a king being enthroned. And so they'll use a lot of language of like God as a warrior, overcoming the sea or overcoming Leviathan, overcoming a lot of the images you see in Genesis, overcoming creation, having power and authority over all creation. So you have these very poetic images of God as king. Royal psalms, so difference between enthronement psalms and royal psalms. Royal psalms are targeted not to God, but to a king. So these are interesting praises, either praises directed at the Davidic king or psalms that are giving them advice and wisdom to the Davidic king and giving guidelines of what makes a righteous king. So we can imagine many of these psalms might have been recited at a coronation ceremony or maybe at a swearing in at an oath of office that we might think about in today's terms. This might have been what was used during the time of the Davidic kings. The next one is Laments. So everyone kind of knows what that is. So songs of sadness or prayers of deliverance of certain situations. So with many of David's songs, you'll see prayers of getting him out of a bad situation, an escape from Saul. Many times he'll talk about betrayal of a friend, and it has a very similar formula for each of these. You basically have a complaints like, a situation that's bad. What's a bad situation? You have an invocation of God, God, please, making some sort of plea or oath to God or vow to God. And then after that, you'll have kind of a resolution, God, you've done this before. You've gotten me through this. You've gotten Moses through the Red Sea. You've done this before. And so kind of a praise, and you see this formula again and again with laments. So just kind of you have a plea, an invocation of God, and then confidence that this plea is going to be heard and applied. The next one is a rare one, and it's usually not mentioned because we don't usually do this nowadays. It's cursing and blessing. If you remember, back in Deuteronomy, there was a really strange commandment that Moses was given once he died and instructed Moses to carry on, which was going on top of this mountain near Shechem and do all these praises, invoke all these blessings upon particular people and all these curses upon a particular people. So back in the ancient times, this was really common to do. So you would go and literally, as you would think of bless, so-and-so, those who, stick to your covenant, who worship the one true God, Yahweh, who are these certain subset of people, God bless these individuals. And that was seen as a very effective way of having God's favor thrown at somebody. And on the other hand, what's even really rare these days is cursing people. We rarely, curse, our neighbor who's, too often on our lawn, right? So we usually don't curse often, but that was also very common in the Bible time. So you would curse your enemies. There's a lot of Psalms that deal with David wanting this military victory, and he's asking for blessings in this particular battle, at the same time cursing for his enemies. And some of these curses are really vicious too. You would not, you'd usually not think of, when you're trying to tell someone how to pray or giving them guidelines, the Bible really breaks some of the rules that you would expect when it comes to cursing one's enemies. But nevertheless, it's definitely evident in the Bible. And last is the wisdom that I talked about earlier about having the path of righteousness and the path of the wicked, and advising an audience to go on the path of righteousness versus that of wickedness. And I'm going to elaborate more on that because it's really the big emphasis of the next book that we're talking about, the Book of Proverbs. So the Book of Proverbs really aims at promoting and celebrating the virtue of wisdom. And we might think about the wisdom as maybe a pragmatic way of going about our everyday life, or something we can apply very easily. But more than just being a handy application, the book of Proverbs really emphasizes the theological implications of wisdom. There's a really interesting vision in Proverbs 7 through 8, having this metaphor of Sophia, of wisdom as a woman that cries into the town center asking to be heard. And not only that, but also someone who was there at creation, at the side of God, having a helping hand in creation. So you get this very deep, rich theological emphasis that we usually don't emphasize when we look at wisdom literature, but it's very deep, and there's a lot of presuppositions that wisdom is mandatory in pursuit of godliness and righteousness. So it's not an optional, something you can be advised for, but something that's essential to a godly man or woman. So most of the book of Proverbs is framed in these adages, or these advice from Solomon to his son, who have been passed down and later preserved, it looks like, by King Hezekiah, according to Proverbs 25, verse 1. And so you get a lot of just general wisdom from many, many, many different things. So this can be wisdom of, kind of like a grandma's wisdom of, do good in school, have the right group of friends, marry the right girl, the right man, the right woman. So having these very wise, consequential words of wisdom that can impact your trajectory of life, you'll see. There's also, I guess I'm getting to the categories of the different proverbs, but there's, the pedagogical wisdom, like kind of that wise man and son kind of motif. There's also observational wisdom for everyday people. There's really specific advice on farming. There's specific advice for getting a loan. There's advice for entering into the royal court. So there's advice for how to be a good court attendant without getting your head chopped off. So you get a lot of practical wisdom that we might not find, like, oh, what is this talking about? That's what it's talking about. It's talking to an audience during this time period. And that would go more into the next one, the court wisdom, advice for scribes, for court attendees, those seeking political success. And then there's the last big category is existential wisdom, of pondering observation of society, the human condition, something that's really emphasized in the book of Job, and also in the next book that we're going into, the book of Ecclesiastes. So our fourth book is the book of Ecclesiastes. It's a deep philosophical observations of a retired king and sage that only identifies himself as Kohelet, the son of David. So we usually translate Kohelet as Ecclesiastes. That's a Greek way of saying it, but many prefer just to call the book Kohelet because that's a more, that's actually what the book is named after, is a sage named Kohelet. So Kohelet is this retired king. He's seen the world, he's gathered this wisdom, and he's reflecting on all that he has seen under the sun, so all that he has seen in his days on earth. And it really, his journey reflects about really how insignificant it all is, how an earthly existence is here today and gone tomorrow. And so you get this very deep philosophical, existential, brilliant piece of genre that's really unlike anything else in the Bible. That's really kind of difficult for those to get into if you don't know what the genre is. And it's a very, very difficult book to follow because it's not like a organized, philosophical argument with, an argument here, argument there, observation argument, kind of the typical philosophical treatise that we're used to. It's more of just musing and reflecting. So often Solomon or Kohelet will have one thought of how terrible this is, and then completely shelf that thought and then come back to it 5 chapters later and rethink of it and make a completely different contradictory explanation or answer. And so there's just a big human element to this, of someone wrestling with the fruitlessness and the futility of life. And it's very much written like that. It's not supposed to be just this coherent answer to all wisdom. It's really almost like Job, very similar to Job, just a wrestling with existence, with the futility of life, with bitterness and a lot of the reality of observations. Because what's the ideal that we find in Proverbs? That the righteous are always going to be rewarded, the wicked are always going to be downtrodden. But what's the reality is they both die. They both the righteous will suffer, and sometimes the wicked will get ahead. Just making a lot of these negative implications that everything isn't fair, everything isn't the way that we want it to be in this fallen world. And so there's 3 major themes that Kohelet really emphasizes. The first one is fertility. So the entire book is framed on that theme of fertility of under the sun. So no matter your lot of life, no matter your character, no matter your sense of justice, you all share the same fate with every living being, that you'll vanish and be quickly forgotten. So there's almost a depressing kind of aura of everything is just so frivolous and senseless in the grand scheme of things. And the next theme is death. So death is just this great inevitable path for everyone, and at the same time a great equalizer across all life. That during our short turmoil, our short toil that we have on earth, is all that God has given us to life. And Kohelet will make a conclusion saying that after saying how fruitless everything is and how pointless everything is, well, you know what? At the end of the day, this short life and the toil that we have is to just enjoy it, is to make the most of it. You have the famous quote of, whatever God, whatever your hands are able to do it well, because that's all you're given. So that's kind of one of the major conclusions he has. That's God's kind of gift is our work. The next is wisdom. And it's really interesting because, Kohelet says all these, assertions and ideas of what it means to be wise and good and what one should do. But at the same time, at the very end, he's basically like, you know what? Don't even listen to this, because even my knowledge, even my great knowledge and wisdom is finite compared to God's infinite knowledge. And so at the backdrop of what all God can do, God is ultimately in control. So even the advice that I'm telling you in this book, it's all kind of rubbish compared to the ultimate knowledge of what God has. So Kohelet will say the best way of understanding wisdom is to knowing its limitations and acknowledging the unlimited nature of God's wisdom, and knowing that God will bring all creatures to account. So that's kind of the ultimate takeaway of Ecclesiastes. So again, a very advanced book, something you can't really dive deep into without being very confused, without having a proper understanding of the genre and really the ultimate theme of the book. And last is, what good collection would be without a great romance to really spice things up, right? We need a good romantic genre to be represented in the literature. And so the book dedicates a whole book dedicated to the celebration of romantic love and human sexuality like no other book in the Bible does, nor as explicit as any book in the Bible does. And the book is, again, kind of like Job, where, it's a story, but it's not. There's no beginning or end, really. It's just this really interesting dialogue between mainly a female speaker and her lover. And there's really no, like I said, beginner or end. It's more of this back and forth of not able to see each other and reconvening and re-seeing each other, and how much each other's love meant to each other. And so there's just these very vivid images and metaphors that are used throughout these, almost like a series of love letters, very personal, private love letters, you can imagine. Vivid descriptions of their affection. They use numerous different metaphors and similes through nature, animals, spices, locations around Israel. So there's just this very rich vernacular that is used throughout to really illustrate this love, this powerful, this potent love, and it really gives just a celebration of just what marriage and a unity of two, a man and a woman coming together in the covenant that God has made for them, and just how beautiful that is, and really amazing poetry and really amazing poetic terms. So one way to interpret it is very similar to one of the prophets named Hosea. Hosea also does this, where he'll have kind of an illustration of love of Israel and to God. And you can kind of interpret the book, the Song of Solomon, as doing a very similar thing, where there's an allegory of God as the male lover and Israel being the woman receiving that love. And so you can definitely see the overlap of God, a different dimension of God's love that you would never really, it's not really emphasized that much, but a very deeply affectionate love that God has for his kind of, not until you see Paul, kind of the church as a bride kind of metaphor. Same could be said with the Song of Solomon. You have God and the state of Israel having that close relationship to one another. So that concludes the book, the wisdom books. So as you see in the table of contents, that's going to basically conclude a lot of what we've covered. When we meet again next time, or our next semester, we're going to cover the rest of the Old Testament. So we've covered Genesis all the way through 2 Samuel, and we've covered Psalms through Songs of Solomon. And so our last series, we're going to really emphasize the successors of the Davidic kings all the way till its end and its restoration. So we're going to focus on 1st and 2nd Kings and Ezra and Nehemiah. But we're also, I don't know how I'm going to do it, but I'm going to do my best to also cram in that last section, that Isaiah to Malachi, and really try to, as we go through 2 Kings, I'm going to try to imprint and mention, Ezekiel, Daniel, Hosea, Joel, Amos, how do they all kind of come together in the book of 2 Kings. And we'll probably have a special class, and just like this class, where we can only cram in so much. We can only really cram in so much when we address the prophets. So maybe, another semester we'll have a dedication just to the prophets, where we can really give them their due. That's it for today. I hope that you have learned more about the wisdom literature, and hope that you can join us next time.